thank you, Mr. President. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today talking to such a great crowd. I had no idea we'd get this turnout and so many prominent people in the various societies are here today. Really appreciate that. Greetings from the Silver State. As Dick said, I'm from Northern Nevada. I've been giving lots of talks, not just about this, but other topics related to the American Revolution. Some of you heard me back in April when I talked to you via Zoom about Paul Revere's Right. That was a lot of fun. And Dick mysteriously decided to ask me back. So thank you again. Well, it is the 250th anniversary, not just year, but month. We've gone through a couple of cycles now since 2023. You know, we did the Boston Tea Party. We did Lexington and Concord. Lots of events around the country. Here we are, not so many events about the siege of Quebec. And I'm just pleased to know I have two fellow descendants of those patriots who marched with Benedict Arnold in the expedition to Quebec. And that's just an amazing coincidence that you two are here. And I appreciate that very much. I'm really going to talk about three subjects, and I'm going to do this very fast because I could spend hours on the subject, but I'm going to talk first about the backstory of Benedict Arnold, leading up to him becoming the commander, the colonel of the, now is referred to as the Arnold Expedition. So a little bit about him. I'll spend most of my time talking about that expedition. It was an expedition from hell, I guess I would put it that way. And it deserves our time and attention because it was one of the most courageous, daring expeditions, 3 months in the wilds of Maine, under the command of Benedict Arnold. But there were so many heroes that took part in that. So I want to talk a lot about that. And then, of course, for those of you who like the battle stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about the battle, which had a lot of tactical issues and mistakes. Quite frankly, we'll talk about that. And I'll take your questions at the end. So you start with the headline. Was Benedict Arnold a hero or a villain?
Yes.
Most Americans, Benedict Arnold, a traitor. The title of my talk was before he was a traitor, because before he was a traitor, he was a hero. He was the hero of this expedition to and the siege of Quebec. He was a hero at Saratoga. He was a hero at Fort Ticonderoga. And he was basically famous among the colonies as one of the true warriors of our continental army. You can see the little, I'm not going to read all of this for you. You can see a little bit of his backstory. Born in 1741, that made him about 34 years old at the time of the Arnold Expedition. So not young, but for a colonel leading hundreds and hundreds of men, this was a very impressive start to his military campaign. Actually, Fort Ticonderoga was for wealthy family, looking good. His father falls on hard times and becomes drunk. The business collapses, and suddenly, 1749, he has to find something else to do. He becomes an apprentice, as you see here. He's gaining experience. He becomes very expert in sailing ships. He becomes a skipper of some of his merchant ships, which stood him in very good stead on Lake Champlain and some of those naval aspects of his military career. Took over trading business in New Haven, and that's where he becomes a warrior. He's living well and marries a very well connected wife with money. But as I say here, rumors of whoring and drinking and dueling and all of that stuff. And of course, he was a cantankerous and sometimes quite ugly personality, according to those who worked with him. So not all that you want to write home about. He was a smuggler. That was pretty common with the British embargoes and so forth that were taking place. So he became a smuggler like John Hancock was. And even before Lexington and Concord, he was starting to dip his toes into the military world. He was not a trained military man. He was a businessman. But as we approached Lexington and Concord, and the hint of revolution was alive and well in New Haven, he starts to use a committee to prepare weapons and get ready for the British coming down to New Haven to either do battle with them or suppress them. And he's elected captain of a local militia a month before Lexington and Concord, and then that battle happens. And word comes down to New Haven just a few days after that. Benedict Arnold is announcing that he's going to mobilize his militia. They're going to join the other militias up in Massachusetts, because that's where the alarm had happened, and so many militias, not just in Massachusetts, but Connecticut, Rhode Island, were migrating up to the Boston area. And here's his quote: that the citizens of New Haven were driven to the last necessity, obliged to have recourse to arms in defense of our lives and liberties. None but Almighty God shall prevent my marching. This is the first indication this man was a born leader. He was going to lead his people into battle. And again, had no training for that, but here he was. And I mentioned Fort Ticonderoga. I won't dwell on that, but that's the very first thing he decides to do. George Washington didn't tell him to do this. George Washington wasn't the commander-in-chief in April of 1775. We didn't even have a continental army. He had a militia, and he said, I think there's a bunch of cannons at Fort Ticonderoga. I'm going to go seize them. And so he gets his militia together, and they go to Fort Ticonderoga. Who does he meet there? Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Ethan Allen thinks he's in charge. Benedict Arnold thinks he's in charge. And the two of them are clashing badly. Ethan Allen sends a letter off to the Continental Congress saying that he was responsible for the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold goes crazy. He disputes it, and it ends up causing him to quit because he wasn't getting the credit. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. Fast forward to when he becomes a traitor. These were the early indications that he felt underappreciated, underpaid, just not being treated the way he should. So he quits, and he goes back to New Haven. New Haven. His reputation is terribly damaged from all this. And, who knew that he would ever resurrect his military career? I say in that last point, his troops, in the meantime, loved him. And this is a common theme all through the time until he becomes a traitor. His troops followed him passionately because he was a passionate leader. If anybody is a scholar about the Battle of Saratoga, that battle was won because his men would follow him in, and they did at Saratoga. So, on to the actual main story here. The question, why Quebec? I guess I would add to that title, why Montreal? Because these were the two targets in this period of the fall of 1775. George Washington, now commander-in-chief, and not so much a Continental Congress, but George Washington concludes we should take Canada. And we're going to do it in two ways. We're going to come up to Montreal, led by General Schuyler. We're going to come up to Quebec, now led by Benedict Arnold. He didn't know Benedict Arnold from Adam. Benedict Arnold, again, he's quit. He has no job in the military. He has no title. He decides to go to Cambridge, which is where George Washington is now headquartered. He introduces himself basically like a cold call, and they talk. And the next thing you know, George Washington has appointed him to be the colonel and the commander of what became the Arnold Expedition. This was kind of out of the blue, but he convinced Washington. Washington was already convinced we need to take Quebec. He convinced Washington, I'm about to do it. So that's what came out of that, out of the blue meeting in Cambridge. And why was Washington popped up on this? Well, you can see in several things that he was focused on. One was General Schuyler is going up to Montreal. We want to distract the British Army that's up in Quebec. There's hundreds of soldiers there. Governor Carleton's there. Let's do a feint to the right, so to speak, or a feint to the left, depending on which way you look at. Cut off the vital supply lines that are coming down from Canada to New York, kind of like the Battle of Saratoga, right? When Burgoyne was coming down from Canada, and to disrupt the alliances of the British and the Native Americans. Unspoken here was what Continental Congress was thinking about. They did want to take Canada. They wanted Canada to become the 14th colony. And that was their overall goal and objective. They thought this was the right target for all the wrong reasons. They thought the Canadians were going to love the Americans. They thought the Canadians would support our war effort. They thought it would be an easy task to go up there with a modest force and now recruit Canadians to join them. That never happened. They were convinced that there weren't many British soldiers up there, which turned out to be totally wrong by the time they got there, mostly because it took so long to get there, and there was no secret about what was happening here, as I'll explain in a second. Washington in September, he's hired Benedict Arnold to be the commander. He knows Benedict Arnold is going to go up to Canada, and he wants him to take something with him, which is what you see here, his address to the inhabitants of Canada. And Arnold does take this up there, and he does, it's almost like a flyer. He's passing it around as he approaches Quebec to the people who are living outside of Quebec. Once it gets to the plains of Abraham, he's got these flyers that he's handing out, and you can see the quotes from Washington. Washington thinks this is going to be a cakewalk. He thinks these people love us. These people are going to support us. Oh, by the way, we'll pay you to support us. What does he say it here? With such applies as your country affords. He basically was offered, treat us well, we will pay for your goods. So that's going on. What does Arnold have to do before he launches this expedition? Well, it's an amazing Herculean task he had ahead of him. And he accomplished this all in 3 weeks. He recruited 1,000, actually 1,150 was the number, over 1,000 troops. He thought he was going to get, and he did get, quite a few who were active woodsmen, well acquainted with bateau. What's a bateau? It's a boat. You remember these were French Canadians, so they were bateaux. And when he assembled all of these troops, there were a fair number of very experienced woodsmen that were among the men that he recruited. And he also, as I say here, he has volunteers. I'll talk about a few in particular. Camp followers, we know what that is, and Indians and dogs. For whatever reason, they had lots of dogs on this particular trip, which ended up coming in good stead when everybody was starving much later on. Had to get the provisions, he had to bring transport ships. They had to build 200 boats in 3 weeks. And they hired a guy on the Quebec River who had a mill up there. He was sort of knowledgeable about building boats. George Washington hires him, he builds 200 boats in 3 weeks. All of this is going on with the hope that this is a secret from the British government. A secret. Well, it couldn't have been clearer what was going on. They were marching in Cambridge. They were marching in Canada. Yeah. And out there on the parade grounds, nobody could miss the fact that something's going on. And they had spies everywhere. The British are watching. One of the huge mistakes that the British made is, of course, they had a giant navy. The Navy was well aware of what was going on, but Vice Admiral Graves said, you know, I'm stretched too thin. I have other projects. I'm not going to try to bottle these people up in Newburyport, Massachusetts, which is where they were gathering before they launched their effort to get up to the Kennebec River. He ended up later on be blamed for this complete failure of leadership, and he was dismissed from the Navy as a result. But imagine what would have happened if he had had some moxie. This expedition would never have happened. So the expedition's launched. You can see the timeline here. A big general order went out on September 5th. This was after Washington had been consulting with General Schuyler. And I haven't really mentioned General Montgomery yet. The New York troops were under the ultimate command of Schuyler, but General Montgomery was his main aide and very experienced warrior, by the way. He had been through the French and Indian Wars, had a reputation of being a great leader himself. But for now, it was General Schuyler who was leading that march up to Montreal. They met, they agreed on the plan. Washington shares the plan with Arnold. They all think they're coordinated, going up to Montreal on the one hand, going up to Quebec. So they launch on September 19. They all put their men on fishing boats to get up to the Kennebec River. They get them up there. It's kind of choppy seas. Some people they get seasick and all of that. They immediately desert. They get to their destination. But so they get the troops up there. A few days later, they're on their way to Fort Western, and I'll show you a map in a second. But there were a couple of ports on that river, which were basically stops along the way before they really did the march. September 26th, really the first day of an actual march. There was a river, but they weren't really using the river to sail themselves up. They were marching. Their provisions were all on boats, and this was a Herculean effort. These were, first of all, very heavy boats. Each of the boats, just by itself, without anything on it, was 400 pounds. And they knew that going upriver, they were going to have to be making multiple portages with not just the 400-pound boats, but all the provisions that were on top of it. This was a major physical challenge to be taking boats up this particular river with so many river crossings and portages. So they're marching, and you can see this map of what I was describing earlier of Montgomery's, they call it Montgomery's route, originally with Schuyler. And he's coming up to Montreal. The plan was always for him to then meet up with Arnold in Quebec. So that's the pincer movement, if you want to call it that. This is a map that was done later on in 1790s to sort of better visualize and capture both the length of this this expedition and some of the way stations along the way. Let me just see if I can interpret this a little bit for you. So at the bottom, I don't know if people can see in the back. Right there, that's Cambridge. That's where George Washington was. B, right there, that's Newburyport, still in Massachusetts. That's where they got into the fishing boats that go up to Kennebec, which is up here. Here's the Kennebec River going up to Canada. C is Fort Western. That's where the 200 boats were being built. That's where they picked up their boats, is right here. They still have a trail at this point, but the trail stops. Now there's no trail. There's an Indian trail, they're told, but it didn't really show up. There were no markings. The Indians didn't leave road signs. The trails were like this, and they needed a trail like this to get the boats through if they were portaging. These were big boats. So the trail was kind of useless, other than if you were going single file, and that's what they did a lot of. So D is Fort Halifax. That's sort of the last port along the way. These were old French and Indian War ports that by the time of 1775 rolls around, they're just dilapidated, they're collapsing, but they're structures. And so they were there and they could refresh a little bit. They hadn't started starving yet, but this was kind of the beginning of the real hard sledding part of it. I say sledding because it did end up encountering snowstorms, the whole thing. B, or E rather, this was called, still is called the Great Carrying Place. Those of you who had Arnold Expedition ancestors know this was a horrific crossing, the Great Crossing, which at bogs, people couldn't see where they were going because the snow covered it. You'd walk along, suddenly you'd hit a bog and you'd sink. Your musket would drown. Your ammunition would get wet. You'd get wet. It was freezing cold. You would get hypothermia. There were no fires. There was no campfires because of the weather, rain, and so forth. So that all starts down here. But when you get up to here, to the Great Carrying Place, half of the men are sick. Half of the men are starving already. And they haven't even gotten to the hard part. So we get up to this, you see this line here. That's a mountain range. The height of land is called it, it's still called that. And that was, but to most of us, that would be impassable. Particularly if you were trying to carry boats onto the other side, which is the main river here, that would lead to Quebec. Quebec is up here, where our friends on Zoom are here. So Quebec's up here. But they wanted to have those boats ready to go down that river. Well, they ended up abandoning all the boats, except for one person, which was Daniel Morgan, who was on the expedition, made it a point that, by God, he and his riflemen were going to carry their boats over that mountain. And they did. And what happened on the other side was they put it in the water, and as soon as they started to go down, the rapids just destroyed all the boats. So he ended up with no boats, not for lack of trying, right? And then lastly, G here, that's the Lake Magantic, I think it's pronounced. That was the ultimate goal, is to get that far, because they've been told, they've read that this is a pretty easy commute from that lake on to Quebec. It turned out not to be. So that's kind of a quick rundown of what it all looked like. I guess I should just quickly stop. Who were all these people? Well, there were quite a few people who went on to great fame, accomplishments in the Revolution itself. I mentioned Daniel Morgan. He'd come all the way up from Virginia with his riflemen. I think he had like 100 riflemen. He marched. When the alarm went out at Lexington and Concord, he's down in Virginia, and he says, "I'm gone." And so he goes up for that reason. He ends up pitching on to the Arnold Expedition. Christopher Green, a cousin of Nathaniel Green, we all know him. He led one of the two divisions. It was Roger Anos and Christopher Green. Terrible stories for each of them. Christopher Green acquitted himself amazingly. He survives the siege. He survives imprisonment. He continues to be a warrior up until 1781, when he's ultimately killed and dismembered by a loyalist militia. Roger Anos turned out to be basically a coward. They got halfway through the expedition. He was in charge of the provisions. He decided it was too much, and he decided to turn around and go home. And that's what he did with 200 men. And Arnold didn't know about this until he disappeared. The provisions were supposed to be coming up to Arnold and his men. They never arrived, and then finally word came back, "Oh, he's gone." He went back to Cambridge. And there's a nice line in some of the correspondence between Arnold and General Washington, where Washington basically says, "Colonel Enos just arrived. What is he doing here?" Right? I'll get to that in a second. So you see at the bottom, this is one of my favorites, Aaron Burr. Some of the people on this expedition weren't in the military, they were volunteers. Aaron Burr was a 19-year-old kid, and he hears about this. He said, I'm gonna go with them. And what we know about Burr, Joe Alexander Hamilton, vice president, he got into some mischief later on and became a persona non grata. At this time, he became a warrior, and he became a hero. And at the actual battle, he was on the ramparts, he was leading men, he was the man who was, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. I think that Aaron Burr's story is just as interesting sometimes as the Benedict Arnold. So this is what they looked like. There was no Continental Army, there were no uniforms. On the left, that's what Captain Morgan would have worn. They had cockades to distinguish themselves. You know, who was an officer and who was not an officer, and they had color coding for the cockades. If you had a feather in your cap, like he did, and then you were a leader of a unit. And then you had the commoners on the right side. They were just kind of coming off of their farms in whatever they could wear. And of course, most of them ran out of clothing during the march, but that's what they basically looked like. They had to cover 400 miles. I mentioned hunger and sickness was a constant threat. All of these river crossings were a constant challenge, physically and otherwise. And then to top it all off, they had this map that had been purloined from the British Army. And this was George Washington's. He thought this was gold. This was the map that was going to help them navigate through the thicket. It was done by a British lieutenant, John Montresor, who ended up going on to some great accomplishments as a British soldier during the Revolution. But he had made this trek back during the French and Indian War, 1760, and then he produced a map, which this is the map. And you kind of have to scratch your head and say, will this really help you on the ground to know where you're going? You can see here, so way down here is where they started with the Kennebec River and the mouth of it, and it goes up this way. You can barely see, even if you have the original, you can barely see. Here's that mountain range, here's the mountain range, and here's the river that would take you to Canada. He did it in reverse. So when he did the map, he was coming down this way. And he kept a journal as well, which you can find online. It's an interesting read. He did this in 21 days. Excuse me, 24 days. It took the Arnold Expedition 80 days to do it. This is how misleading it was to General Washington when he heard, oh, this map, we can do this in 21 days. This is what Arnold thought. And the element of surprise was underneath all of this. Washington, Arnold, they all thought, we're going to scoot up there. The fort in Quebec is undermanned. We're going to surprise you. Well, that didn't happen because it took so long to get there. A couple of people were mentioning their ancestors who were there. I have to do a plug for my ancestor, William Humphrey. Along the way, there were multiple soldiers who were keeping diaries. And we have them still today. You can read them, day-to-day accounts of the ordeal that they were going through. This just happens to be my ancestors, William Humphrey, who was a lieutenant at the time, and he went all the way through the war. Was at Valley Forge, was at Yorktown, but he kept his journal. It still exists. It's in the basement of the Rhode Island Historical Society. But he started in September, went all the way through his ultimate imprisonment. Pretty much all the officers were imprisoned after the battle. They ultimately were released on parole, and then there was a prisoner exchange and so forth. That's his Society of Cincinnati certificate. Right, he was a warrior. But his journal is interesting reading. All of these are available online, and so if you want to get into the weeds of what the day-to-day conditions were like, I encourage you to look at some of these diaries. And these are a couple of quotes, but it kind of underscores the severity of what they were going through. Last night it froze so hard as to freeze our wet clothes. Can you imagine? And this was going on for 2.5, 3 months, every day. Relentless, cold, relentless moisture, wet, hunger, famine, disease. Oh, and did I mention smallpox? Towards the end, smallpox creeps into the equation, and many of the soldiers are dying. By the time they were done, out of the original 1,100, they only had 600 men left by the time they got to Quebec. So it turned out to be 350 miles, not the 180 miles that George Washington thought. It took 45 days. I said 80, I was wrong. 45 days, not 20. Talked about the plateau. They were carrying 100 tons of provisions, or at least they thought they were going to carry 100 tons all the way. They ended up having to abandon most of it if it didn't already crash and go into the water, as much of it did. It spoiled. It was washed downstream. They lost most of their fruit along the way. The flooding and snow and so forth was disguising whatever semblance of a trail there had been. I mentioned the bogs and Major, Lieutenant Colonel and Sacred. So Roger Enos, midway through, he returns to Cape. He takes through. Here's some of the correspondence between Arnold and General Washington. What shocked me, this is all on Founders Online. Those of you who have ever gone there, it's a very rich resource. Just all of the correspondence of the leading figures, and there's a lot of correspondence between Washington and Arnold in there, but he's basically, you would imagine in the middle of nowhere, how are you going to get a letter back to your commanding officer? Well, they had runners going back and forth, so you can see in this time period, they were exchanging letters back and forth, and most of it was bad news going back to General Washington. He basically saying, hey, we're starving, we're running out of ammunition, we have all of these problems, our boats are sinking. Our march has been, I love this, our march has been attended with an amazing deal, what's the word, of fatigue. I had been much deceived in the recount, talking about the map, among other things. I was deceived into thinking we knew what the route was gonna be, instead of getting lost, because this was what happened. And then this is the moment that George Washington sees Lieutenant Colonel Enos coming into Cambridge. What the heck? And so he was immediately court-martialed, he was put under arrest. Guess what? He was acquitted. Why? Because the only testifiers at his trial were the men who came back with him. And who's gonna say anything other than, yeah, he made a good decision. You know, here we are. And so he was acquitted, and he went back into service and continued participating in the war. Okay. Just not more. Okay, let's go. There we go. All right. I said I was going to get a little bit into battle tactics real quick. So, first of all, they were on the plains of Abraham. Some of you know the French and Indian War. This was a famous spot when the British defeated the French, attacking from the plains of Abraham. Well, here we were again. Colonel Arnold's folks were up here across this river, and Montgomery had come with his troops. Why Montgomery and not Schuyler? Well, Schuyler got sick and had to go back, and so he appointed Montgomery to take over. Montgomery, in the meantime, during this crossing of the north of Maine, he had just taken Montreal. So big victory. He could have just stopped, but he kept going, and so he came with his troops, 200 troops. He added to the mix. So he's down here. The pincer movement here was going to be Colonel Arnold and his troops who were on the expedition coming this way, and Montgomery with his troops from New York coming this way. The main warfare took place here at this point. This was lower Quebec, the lower town, and this was the upper town. This was kind of impregnable. Giant walls, cannons, you know, the whole works. And so the strategy, the tactic was to kind of come around the back door. And so best laid plans, right? Arnold decided to have Daniel Morgan and his riflemen lead the charge here around this curve. And right here, you can see two barricades, the first and second barricades. And then over on this side, there's, can't read the word, but it's a fortified house right here. And Montgomery would have to get past the fortified house. So they would meet here. There were stairs then that they could climb up and go up and attack Carleton and his troops up here. In the meantime, the troops are not, they're standing up there doing this. They're just shooting down, it's like shooting down up there, they're just shooting like crazy, they got cannon that are shooting like crazy. But they're doing this, and so I'll start with Montgomery. So this is a tragic story. He has his troops, he's coming along. This fortified house, everybody thought was empty. But it wasn't, it was filled with British soldiers with muskets and cannon. And they were just waiting for him. And they waited until Montgomery, who was out in front, he was not behind, he was waiting out in front, he was right there. They wait for him to come up and they shoot him in the head, his head explodes, and he dies on the scene, right there, instantaneous. His second in command decides, well, I don't like the look of this, he turns around and turns back. So they never make this assault that they were supposed to make, that would have helped. On this side, with Daniel Morgan, Morgan leads his troops over the first barricade, over the second barricade, but he realized he's grossly outnumbered, so he's gonna wait for Montgomery, who never comes. And in the meantime, the British are adding more and more troops. They bring troops behind him. And now he's trapped. He's stuck between the first and second barricades. They're up on the top of the barricades, shooting down, slaughtering the men who either are trying to escape or they go hide. This is a village, so there's houses on both sides, so everybody's trying to take cover. They're hiding houses, trying to save their lives, but it's pretty much everybody for himself at this point. It's just absolute heck. And so finally, Morgan surrenders, he's left. The historians say he was the last person to surrender. And I don't know if that's true, but he was hell bent to continue the battle, but his men talked him out of it, so he surrendered. Arnold's wounded in the meantime. He was up here, like coming around the corner when somebody up on the barrack, or up on the fort here, shot him in the leg. And he's incapacitated in excruciating pain. They carted him back to a hospital over this river. He's back up here for the rest of the battle. And he doesn't know for several days what's happening. He doesn't know that they've lost the battle. He doesn't know that all of the men who haven't been killed have been imprisoned. And he learns that on January the 2nd. This is all happening, by the way. Notice this. The battle is on, they were going to launch on December 30. They ended up launching on December 31 at 2 in the morning. The attack doesn't really start until 4 a.m. and the surrender doesn't happen until 9 a.m. So they've been out battling for, 5 hours in blinding snow. And I need to stop and mention, why did they do this on New Year's Eve? Does anybody know?
Enlistments were running on.
Exactly. So these were militia. These were not Continental Army. There was no 3-year enlistment. These were 6-month enlistments. They were all expiring on December 30. That's why they decided to attack. He had no choice. He was going to lose his men the next day. And absolute, hurricane force winds and a snowstorm happening on December 31. From Arnold's perspective and from Montgomery's perspective, that was a good thing because they needed to not be seen. There was good weather a couple of days before that, but they didn't want to attack in good weather. They wanted to go at night when they would be concealed by the west. So a snowstorm was a good thing as far as they were concerned. So that's why they moved. And so by 9 a.m., the battle is over. The men were imprisoned. They stayed in prison for at least until August of the following year. I know you have a diary that stopped at some point, but my ancestors' diary kept going through the period of imprisonment. It was a tough time. They at least segregated the officers. They had a little bit of a better time. They were getting decent food and, shelter and beds and so forth, but the average soldier was in basically a cattle pen, something like that. So that's the story of the actual battle. 400 of our soldiers were killed, wounded or captured. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded. is from Humphrey's journal, had been unfortunate enough to become a prisoner. He was very understated in his journal about the travails of this imprisonment. So he had some very emotional words in his journal about being missing, and they have died in a glorious cause. And I have to say, I mean, this was beyond the call of duty what these men did, not just to get there, but this fight that they engaged in snowstorms on New Year's Eve, malnourished, not enough ammunition. They had a cannon, the cannon wasn't strong. They thought, oh, we'll have a siege. We have one cannon. They have 30 cannons, and they're big ones. Our little guy can't even put a dent in their wall of their fort. So, horrible planning all the way around. This is a famous painting of the death of General Montgomery. John Trumbull, a very famous painter. Painted Washington, painted a lot of the founding fathers and so forth. But he took it upon himself to memorialize the death of General Montgomery because it was a very big deal. He became a beloved figure as a result of his valor. Yes, sir.
My patriot ancestor, William Burr, named his firstborn son, Richard Montgomery Burr.
Yeah. Well, he was revered for what he did. And in fact, today, there was a monument to his memory in New York City, at Trinity Church, which is where he's now buried. And so if you go to New York City, you can go see that. But he became, a hero. Posthumously, yes, sir.
I'm from Dayton, Ohio, which is in Montgomery County, which is named after Richard Montgomery, so I first joined the Sons of the American Revolution.
Awesome. So what's the aftermath? Well, Arnold is not going to defeat. He's wounded. He's not going anywhere, but by God, he's not gonna leave. And he stays and he tries to keep his troops together and stay focused. The smallpox is running rampant with his men. He can't stop it. I actually read in my guy's diary that they were inoculated before he got inoculated. So I don't know how many of the troops that weren't prisoners were getting inoculated, but they were dying in droves in this months afterwards. Finally, Arnold was ordered back to Montreal. Why? Because the British are sending more troops. And there's absolutely no way he can stay and accomplish anything. So he heads off back to Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. The parole is signed in August. The men are released, and they sail back to Massachusetts in August together. I'm gonna end on this. Back to my question: was he a hero or a villain? There are still plaques honoring Benedict Arnold, both in the U.S. and Canada. If you go to the Kennebec River, there's a very positive message on this plaque about his heroism and what he accomplished. He became a hero. He wasn't so much a hero after Fort Ticonderoga. This made him a hero. Even though he lost the battle, he was considered to be such a warrior, and this trek of his with his men was so astounding that the newspapers all over the colonies just revered him. So there's a plaque there. There's a plaque in Quebec that he was the enemy, and yet they recognized his heroism. And the plaque basically says, well, I can actually read it to you. It's in French and English. Near this spot, Lieutenant Colonel Benedict Arnold was wounded on December 31, 1775, after having taken the first barricade, which protected the entrance to the street, such a street, and to the lower town of Quebec. So they saw fit to honor him. And it's still there. We have our views about his traitorous ways, but I would answer that original question: hero or villain? He was both. And certainly, I don't want to end without saying there were hundreds of heroes in this battle. There were hundreds of heroes who made that expedition, who fought for their country, who died for their country. It's not just about Benedict Arnold, it's about our men, our patriots, our patriot ancestors in some cases. And so that's why I'm here to tell this story. I think it was one of the most astonishing, momentous events in the history of the war. So I'll take your questions. Yes. Sir.
Yeah, I had two questions. First of all, you're talking about the trek itself and how difficult it was. So how was it that they were able to get letters back and forth? That's the first.
They had couriers, and in some cases they were Indians.
Okay,
So he had, I think one historian counted 50. There might have been 50 Indians who were part of the expedition, and they kind of knew the trail better than the soldiers, so they would run back and forth. But yeah, it blew my mind, actually, that they were able to correspond in the midst of all this.
my second question is, did the prisoners get back pay?
You know, I don't think any veteran got back pay. They got land, right? And some of them were still fighting for their pay and their land in the 1830s. So I think the practical answer is no. That's right.
So this is an interesting factoid, not a question, but when we were at our national congress in Connecticut, we visited a cemetery in Norwood Town, to do a patriot grave marking ceremony. And the townsfolk were so upset with Arnold's treason that they threw his father's headstone and I guess a deceased son's headstone into the local river.
Hmm.
Yeah, the rest of his like sisters and mothers still there and marked.
There is I mean, if this long, there is a monument to him at Saratoga. It just doesn't use his name. But it's still there, and it's in honor of his valor on the field of battle at Saratoga too. They just felt, you know, that was decades and decades ago, and that was a politically correct thing to do at the time. It's just, don't mention his name. But he was a hero.
Yeah. And I kind of have an answer for his second question. My patriot ancestor's pension application states that he was officially enlisted into the Continental Army on 1 July 1776 while in captivity. And it listed Lieutenant Colonel Green as his commanding officer. He didn't cite his participation at Lexington and Concord in his pension application.
Well,
So whether he was paid or not, I don't know, but that's what he was using for proof of pension.
interesting. But most of them, when they went to join the expedition, were not in the Continental Army. They were in Cushing. So unless there was some sleight of hand where Washington said, okay, now we're gonna call them all Continental Army soldiers, I don't know. I don't know what that. Other questions? Thank you.